Good afternoon. Or is it morning? I guess it is morning, isn't it? It's afternoon somewhere in the world, so we'll just all celebrate globally. That's how you start something, by messing up, I guess. Non-white Alabamians are as unfit to make laws as an elephant to teach music. John G. Harvey, a Hale County lawyer and journalist who owned and edited the Alabama Beacon newspaper, made this statement in March 1873. At the time, numerous blacks and smaller numbers of whites in the state were advocating for passage of a civil rights bill at both the state and the federal levels. They wanted to do so essentially to counter legal and extra-legal measures to prevent them from enjoying the rights and privileges of citizenship. 1 month later, in April 1873, the Jacksonville Republican newspaper, which, though its name is Republican, of course, was a Democratic sheet, in Calhoun County asserted, "The Negroes of the legislature have civil rights on their minds again. If they were more civil to their white superiors in the legislature, they would get their rights sooner." I'm quite confident that the vast majority of black folks and egalitarian white folks, when the 13th Amendment was passed in December 1865, did not think that however many years later such statements would still rather be made, at least not openly and publicly like that. But that's exactly what happened during the state's Reconstruction, its traditional post-war years from 1865 until 1864. Actually, there were two Reconstructions, so to speak, or at least two periods of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1870, a short break where Republicans headed statewide government, particularly at the gubernatorial level, and then a second period of redemption or restoration or Bourbon democracy, some folks say, from 1874 moving forward. This ballot box symbolizes essentially what freedom, in a sense, particularly political freedom, meant for African Americans following the American Civil War. It's about 2 feet long, about 14 inches in diameter. You'll see that there's an open slot that is closed, of course, but that's where the ballots would be placed. This voting process was truly a public event during Reconstruction. There was no closed ballot. There was no Australian ballot. Individuals had to actually make their way to the polling place. Oftentimes, these places were in municipalities, particularly county seats, because they were more secure than, say, more bucolic areas of the county in which the election would be held. Even then, voting was a dangerous process, or could be a dangerous process, particularly for individuals who were not in heavily black places. But even there was a bit of concern. Not simply having to cast your ballot in front of individuals who perhaps would be your employer, or who owned the land on which you work if you were a tenant farmer, or who likewise had the ability to turn down you perhaps for a loan if you were applying for it. But other individuals who, whilst you were en route to make it to the polling place, might caution you about voting. One individual, for example, in Lee County said in 1874 that he was warned that if he were to vote for any ticket other than the Democratic and Conservative Party ticket, he would not only lose his job, but he would also lose his place of residence. He would lose the place of residence because he actually lived at the place where he actually worked. This particular box is sometimes referred to as the mule mount ballot box. And the reason for that is relatively simple. It was small enough that one could mount to the back of a mule or some related animal and then move from place to place. Ideally, again, as I stated, this polling place would be located in a place where security was ramped up, or security rather could be ramped up. But officials sometimes had a difficult time attempting to secure these types of places where the vote could be enjoyed freely. In 1870, in particular, again, when the Republican candidate for governor was defeated in a not so very ethical manner by his Democratic challenger. And then again in 1872, when the Republican won and the backlash from that was not so very kind. In fact, there were essentially two competing governments that were established in Alabama during those years. And then the second and the permanent sort of restoration or redemption of conservative democratic rule in Alabama in 1874, we need not talk about that, because I'm quite confident if you are here today, then you are aware of the type of violence and vitriol that accompanied that particular race as well. A former governor who was not yet in office in 1874 later would say that although virtually everyone who was an official of elections in the state knew that there was an ethical way, there was a legal way to carry out elections, they just didn't do it because the matter of fact was this: if black persons in particular were allowed to vote freely and openly, the sheer number of those individuals during Reconstruction would almost always guarantee a Republican election. And white persons belonging to the Democratic and Conservative Party simply could not allow that to happen. Of course, we today in 2019 know that that will never happen. An election shall never be stolen. All the same, this ballot box again represents what political freedom as a microcosm of other types of freedom represented for Alabama. This ballot, an individual being able to vote if he were black and if he were male, as of 1870, that was the sort of theoretical axis on which Reconstruction turned. Thank you.
Well, good morning. It's an honor to be here with a panel of really distinguished speakers. I'm a forester by training, so I feel a bit out of place, but I'll bumble along as an unsophisticated forester and talk about this item right here, which I donated to the archives approximately 10 years ago, and it was one, like many of the things that we foresters do, and that's pick up stuff in the woods. This particular piece actually came from Atmore, and I didn't pick it up in the woods. I got it from a man who was formerly in the business, but it's a stepping off point to talk about what was once a really large industry in Alabama, one of the largest natural resource industries in Alabama, and that's the naval stores industry, or the gum resin industry. So this is a pine gum dip bucket, and it's really not all that impressive, and I'm actually embarrassed to say that in my office at one point I had a wastebasket inside it, and I used to throw my garbage inside to hide my wastebasket. But here it is in safekeeping now. So let's go back to 200 years ago to what the first Alabamians saw, and that was an immense pine forest. And in fact, here's two pictures of some of those scenes that they would have seen. On the left is Ingram Day Lumber Company, which would have been down around Chatham, Alabama. And then on the right is down just south of Bruton, Alabama. So this immense pine forest. And what is our state tree of Alabama? Longleaf pine, and that's certainly one of those large forest types, about 11 million acres in Alabama. And then another one that was an immense forest type was slash pine forest, like we see down along the coast, about 2 million acres a bit. And then loblolly at the time was not widely planted, so there wasn't as much of it 200 years ago, and that's come in since then. So as they came upon this forest, I mean, obviously there were utilitarian uses for it. How can we use this natural resource to our benefit, to, make money? We can, there's so much of it that will never diminish it. And one of those, of course, was the naval stores industry. So to talk a little bit about naval stores, and just I'll point out this picture. This is Call Lumber Company land up around Coosa County, Alabama. And you'll notice the scars on the tree, and I'll talk about those in a second. To understand the naval stores industry, we really have to understand what was going on at the time, and that's the navies of the world, the British Navy, the Spanish, the French to a certain extent, and the American later. These were all wooden ships, and wood, there's a lot of things about it that just, it's buoyant, but also it's not necessarily waterproof. So there are things that had to be done to make these ships waterproof. So, various things like caulking, as this picture shows right here, where they're, caulking between the beams, where they may use tar on these threads to caulk the ship, or ropes, or boards, or sailing tackle. All of that, they weren't producing this synthetically, so they needed something to waterproof those. And they knew that in Europe, a lot of this material, this pitch and tar, was being produced in France and Sweden to a certain extent. And to say, if you're the British Army or the British Navy or the Spanish Navy, it was really hard to run a navy if a different country that you were often at odds with had all the natural resources. So they really needed to find a place where they could produce these naval stores. So it's one of North America's oldest industries. It began in Nova Scotia in the 1600s, and then it moved into Virginia, where they found the beginning of this immense longleaf pine forest, and then it moved into the Carolinas, Tar Heels, describes the pitch and tar industry. And then in the late 1700s, we start seeing it in Mobile as well, Mobile, Alabama. And then it spread from there, so that by the time we got to about the 1880s, it was a pretty large industry, and the industry was starting to evolve. We still had wooden ships, but we were finding other uses for these naval stores products as well. So, being a forester, let me just geek out for a second on forestry stuff, because George Bankston, Dr. Bankston, who used to teach at Auburn, I was fortunate to have met him many years ago, and I'd say, well, yeah, they used to get the sap, and he's like, no, John, it's not sap. Sap is a different product of the tree. Sap, you got the veins of the tree, the xylem and the phloem, and it's a watery substance that moves up and down the tree, and it has things like hormones and sugars and minerals in them. That's not what they were going after. What they were going after is technically called resin, or oleoresin is the proper term, and that's essentially what most pine trees have here in the South for a form of protection. Here's a picture of pine bark beetles trying to get into the tree, and the tree is producing these resins to get the beetle out of the tree. So it was a form of protection. So it's not sap. Sap was mostly a watery substance, and thank goodness if you had waffles or pancakes this morning that you know the difference, because if you put resin on your pancake, it would not taste as good. And resin is a slightly thick and slightly amber in color, as you see here on the left. And that's what they were going after. So to go after it, you had to essentially wound the tree. And that's what they did. And it's not terribly different than how maple syrup was produced. I mean, they stuck something in it to wound it. And that's what they did. And you can see here on the left, they have this mark on the tree. And coming out of these resin ducts is this oleoresin. And early in the industry, they would cut a notch on the base of the tree, and it would settle in that notch, and then they would go collect it. It looks, for all intents and purposes, is what we call sap, but it's white material that smells very resinous. And then we learned through time that we could adopt this French method of collection, where we have a series of gutters and cups on the tree. And I think in the display, there's actually one of those cups as well. And again, at the time, a lot of this material was being produced in Europe and France. Here's a picture I found online where they're producing it. And again, if you're the British Navy, you don't want the French being the sole producer of stuff you need to keep your ships afloat. There's the range map for the tree that they were taking this material from. But there was also some produced in India, along this small belt in India, the cheer pine. Same sort of method, but we used that, we adopted it, and used it in this country. So back to the southeast, here's the range map of slash pine and longleaf pine. We look at Alabama, it's most of the state. We know that longleaf pine is an abundant producer of oleoresin. Here's one of the natives in longleaf pine forest, a red-cockaded woodpecker, who likes to build its nest in the live tree, and that's resin comes down and uses it to keep things like snakes out of its cavity. But we also found, through the work of people like Dr. George Bankston, that slash pine was a much more abundant producer of resin as well. So the process was essentially this. They go out, as I mentioned, they wound the tree. They create a face, and that's the worked area of the tree. You see this man right here creating a face. And then he uses a tool called a hack, as you can see, that he's got in his hand, and I think there's one of those on display as well. And as each year, as that goes higher and higher, they have to get a bigger tool, and that they use what's called a puller for something to create these streaks that's above shoulder level. And all of that's collected into a cup. It's just a container to catch the gum. And prior to that, they used the box where they cut into the base of the tree to collect it. And the average time frame for something like this would have been 7 to 10 years of production. And then once the tree played out, they cut it, took it to the mill, and so forth. So there may have been, like a particular turpentine producer may have had a crop, which is 10,000 faces. So each one of those white faces that he was creating with the gum on it was considered, it was a face, and a crop was 10,000 of those. So, and here's some other numbers that you can read just as easily, but, it was a pretty large area, hundreds of acres that they were working at any one time. And then all of this was overseen. So here's the guy making the hack. And actually, this is the first time we're seeing, there's our bucket right there. He's taking this gum out of this cup and putting it in the dip bucket. At that point's called dip. And then there's the woods rider who's essentially checking on everybody. So the dip, again, it's this gum or oleo resin in its liquid phase. And it's taken maybe once or twice each year, depending on how much the tree is producing, and put into this dip bucket right here. And here's a predecessor, it's wooden, and then we move to galvanized metal. And then I just threw this in here for comparison. There's the old box that they cut on the side of the tree as well. But they would take that material and put it in the bucket. And then they'd put them in barrels and then take them to a distillery. Well, a lot of Scotch-Irish settling in this part of the world, we understood distilleries and how they worked. We could take this resin and then produce side products off it. Spirits of turpentine, for example, or rosin was another byproduct as well. And here's just another picture. And these would vary in size from little mom and pop operations such as Bay Minette here to much larger operations such as this is Pensacola, but like that. And some of these larger operations, towns grew up around them, like you see right here. And these are just some statistics, but this map is showing you by about 1935, Alabama had approximately 2.2 million acres of forest land in production of naval stores. And at this point, we're moving, in the 1930s, we're moving more towards strict production of spirits of turpentine and rosin. 1906 to 1914 were considered the boom years, with about 60% of this being exported to Europe still. And then the industry largely played out in the 1960s. As you can imagine, this was a very labor-intensive operation. Nobody likes to go out and work in the woods every day. Well, some people do. I do. But most people don't. It's difficult. It's challenging. There's snakes. There's bugs. All the things that you expect in the woods. And it's just very labor-intensive and dangerous. Those stills caught fire all the time. So it played out in the 1960s. I was actually fortunate to see the last active turpentine orchard, and that was just outside of Okefenokee Swamp in the late 1990s, and I think it closed in around 2000. So, with that, I'm going to wind down and just say, as you're, well, let me just add that it got labor intensive, and as most things in this country, when they get labor intensive, we outsource them. So most of this stuff now comes from China or other places in the world. But the legacies of it are still around, and you may not recognize the importance of them, but they're here. And here's just some of them. I mean, obviously, many of us remember these sorts of things in our grandparents' garage or parents' garage. Gum turpentine was very important, had numerous uses. And then, of course, if you've ever played baseball, you may know about rosin bag, or if you're a bull rider, you may know about, probably maybe one or two of you in the audience, but soap is one, and then it made a great solve as well, and that was something that a lot of people used, was a turpentine solve, not only on themselves, but they would use them on livestock as well. And then, of course, there's various parts of it that may be used in things like bubble gum or gunpowder or makeup even. And then, of course, there's this cultural thing where people use rosin to help cook potatoes as well. So anyway, at one time, a very lively industry in the state of Alabama, and it, like many others, has kind of gone by the wayside, but it had some importance, and a lot of our cultural identity was tied to this industry. So with that, thank you very much for your time.
Good morning. My artifact for today is the railroad. That's a pretty big artifact. But, oops, and also, I figure out which way to go here. The title of my presentation is the diaspora, the first phase of the great African diaspora out of the African-American diaspora out of the cotton fields and into the industrial centers of the United States. Between 1880s and 1900, 52,000 African Americans migrated out of the Black Belt and into the Birmingham area, into Jefferson County. Many of the men sought work in the ore mines. And this is a picture of one of the earliest ore mining operations on Red Mountain. They're standing on top of a red iron ore bluff that they mined down. And you can imagine it was tough work. But because they knew hard work, I mean, perhaps their fathers had been slaves, they became the most productive ore miners in North America and most profitable. But look at this picture here. Let me see if I can find the pointer. Look at the feet. These guys worked barefooted for 10 hours a day in an ore mine. That's tough conditions. Now, why did they do that? Promise of new homes away from the cotton fields. The companies built a series of company towns on the southeastern face of Red Mountain, Wares, Reading, Smythe, Iscuda. And they built saddlebag houses. These were small two-room duplexes, a room on this side, a room on this side, with a dividing wall and a chimney and fireplace that opened into both ends. Those were advantageous to the owners because they were cheap to build. They were board and batten construction, but they also had another advantage, probably more important advantage, was the fact that that was the most common form of architecture on the big plantations immediately before the outbreak of the Civil War. So by transplanting the architecture into the ore mines, you could possibly transfer also simultaneously the old customs and values, those customs of interaction between whites and blacks that always gave the white man the upper hand, and then you could translate that into control over labor union problems. I did a study of the Smythe mining camp with an effort to understand the working conditions in the mines there. We excavated, and of course here you can see the roll of the railroad comes right through town. You step out on your front door of your house and see the railroad every day. But we looked at 4 houses or 4 structures, a commissary, one of the saddlebags, and 4 others in order to try and understand life in the camps. By 1900 or 1890 or so, the surface ore had been mined out and the mines had gone underground. This is a map of the underground mine works, but down here you can see the houses of Smythe. So a miner would come out every morning, walk up to the top of the hill there, get on a car and ride down to the bottom of the mine works. And it's a kind of an irony here that during the day he's working 400 feet below his house above ground there. And what kind of conditions existed in the camps? Overcrowding. And once again, well, I have the statistic here, 350 out of every 100,000 mine camp residents died of either tuberculosis or typhoid. So it was pretty grim. And one of the things that arose, and once again related to the railroad, was this situation gave rise to the snake oil salesman, or at least it ushered in a new generation of the snake oil salesman capable of marketing his product across the entire United States. One of the leading snake oil salesmen was Dr. King out of Chicago. He had a big warehouse and a store, and he marketed one of his most popular products was Dr. King's new discovery for consumption. Consumption being another word for tuberculosis. Now, every train terminal, every small town all across America could distribute Dr. King's new discovery, so that an isolated farmer out in Topeka, Kansas could brag about his wife being in the best mood he'd seen her in 10 years since she'd started taking Dr. King's medication every morning. But in the mining camps, it took on a grimmer tone, because with the statistics that we have, tuberculosis was common. Hardly would you ever see a mine camp in which at least one of the residents wasn't suffering from tuberculosis, possibly in a terminal stage, with lack of medical care. So a remedy like Dr. King's new discovery, a combination of morphine and chloroform, you might be able to ease the last days of that person, grim as it was. Poor sanitation was another factor. One traveler driving through one of the mine camps noted that all the children playing outdoors had dirty clothes on, kind of sooty, and she attributed that to lack of pride by the miners and their wives and so forth. But the real culprit there was, wrong button. Oh no, I've blown it here. Wait a minute. Was the lack of water. This pipe here was the entire supply of the mine camp. It ran behind the houses, faucet every 3 or 4 houses. That was all the water that was available. You can imagine a mother trying to do a load of clothes and scrub her kids down in the evenings when she had to share a faucet with 2 or 3 other neighbors, outdoor faucet. Another thing that complicated that problem was the fact that the mines supplied, once again via the railroad, coal from their coal mines. The miners burned that in their fireplaces for heat, and then dumped the coal ash out in the backyard. So these big piles of coal ash accumulated. And if you can imagine, a hot August day in the middle of the summer, kids are not going to spend their day in that one-room shack. They're going to be outdoors. They're going to be running like kids do everywhere. 30% or more of the population of Smythe were children between 11, under the age of 11 years old, and so they're out there and they're going to get dirty, but it wasn't a matter of lack of pride. Another issue was conflict. Almost immediately, the unions began to try and organize the workers, and a series of strikes broke out. One of the most notorious or the most noteworthy was the strike of 1899. Dramatic headlines appeared in newspapers, either pro-union or pro-company. And also, there was no dearth of charismatic preachers who would preach the gospel according to the company or preach the gospel according to the union. But the main thing that, the main factor in the outcome of the strikes was once again the railroad. Because if you look at this manuscript census on one of the houses in Smythe, 1900, what you see is a group of, in one of the duplexes, 4 young bachelors from South Carolina. They were brought in to break the strike. The strike breaking ultimately led to the end of the strike. But it didn't end one of the major confrontations, and that was over quality of life. The railroad was able to assemble and bring to every commissary in every one of these little camps a vast array of consumer goods. Problem with that was the companies owned the commissaries. They owned the medium. They issued clacker and company script, and you had to use that to buy products. The miners wanted to be paid in cash. As you can see in this quote here, we'll give you the best of our service. We'll do the best work we can, but we don't want to be paid in rations. Slaves were paid in rations. We want to be paid in the money of the land. Well, they lost the strike, but they continued to pressure to be paid in the money of land, and beginning with TCI, they ultimately achieved that goal. And once they started being paid in cash, they were given an alternative. They could go out and shop for better prices and a greater diversity of goods. And that led to the rise of the downtown merchants. We all know the merchants that were around in our day, but the first major merchant in the Birmingham area was J.L. Shalifo and Company. And I think it's really very telling that the motto of J.L. Shalifo was terms positively cash on delivery. And it was a great democratizing process too, because Woodward Iron Company, the president of Woodward Iron Company, bought his suits here, but also the miners from a place like Smythe bought their suits there as well. And they could buy tokens. They could receive a token with every purchase, accumulate a mass of those tokens, and use it for cash as well. Now, what is important about this, in my mind, for the future is the fact that not only have you got these downtown merchants, but you've also got the support of the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce had they had their office in the upper story of this building. That played an important role in the future, because if you look forward to the 1960s, there had been a kind of a symbiotic relationship developed between the downtown merchants and the African American community. And that bond began to strengthen, strictly commercial, strengthen over time. And by the 1960s, when the civil rights leaders in Birmingham decided that boycott would be one of their most effective weapons, they were pulling on a tradition of strong relationship between the black community and the African American community. So, thanks a lot.
Good morning. So, I'm Kellie Bowers, and I'm a collections curator here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And I'm filling in for Ryan Blocker, who couldn't be here today. As many of you may know or have heard Ryan speak before, she's a textiles specialist, and she has an incredible amount of knowledge and a good dose of charisma as well to go along with it. Unfortunately, for all of you, I'm an archaeologist who's about to give a talk on a quilt. So we're going to see how this goes. But before I get started on the quilt, I do want to let you know a little bit about our textiles collection, because I actually know a few things about that. We have pieces that range from 1768 all the way until pretty much yesterday. They represent a wide swath of purposes and socioeconomic backgrounds, races, genders. We go all the way from the utilitarian, no-nonsense gray wool flannel shirt all the way to story quilts that highlight the events of families all the way back from the 19th century all the way to the 21st century. We have the planner elite and the midwife. We have military uniforms all the way from the Civil War up through the War on Terror, not to mention our collection of Civil War flags, which is the third largest in the United States. So we're really lucky to have those items here in our collection, and we're going to talk about one of them today. So the Bachelor's quilt. In January of 1900, Will Reynolds, as pictured, married Mattie Johnson in Conecuh County. To celebrate the occasion, friends and family of the couple gathered together to hand-piece this Columbia puzzle quilt top. The squares were signed by the quilters, and the top was gifted to Will and Maddie in the hopes that the quilt would be finished by Maddie at a later date, as she would be physically and symbolically being woven and quilted into the community, which is pretty cool. Making quilts to celebrate a marriage was not an uncommon occurrence in Alabama. Women, like those pictured here, would gather together to add pieces to the trousseau of the bride. This was a time to celebrate, to get to know each other, and to socialize. Here's another wedding quilt in our collection. It's called the Mount Ida quilt. And it's another example of wedding quilts in our collection. It's made by the women of Welsh and Mallory families in 1851. The quilt depicts not only the skill of the makers, but also wealth in the Talladega area in the 19th century. So this was also a way that communities could express themselves, and that we today can kind of get to know what that community was like. Unfortunately, the story of Will and Maddie's marriage was not a happy one. Within a year of their wedding, Maddie passed away during childbirth. After Maddie's death, Will moved over to the Red Level area of Covington County. There, he meets Lua Ard. In July of 1808, Will and Lula marry. Their marriage certificate is pictured here from Covington County. It's pretty cool that we have access to that. And as a wedding gift, to keep along with our textiles theme, Will buys Lula this sewing machine. What's great about the sewing machine is that it also represents the growing popularity of sewing machine availability at home to the sort of at-home seamstress. This is an ad from the 1908 Montgomery Advertiser, and it's while sewing machines were becoming more prevalent, hand quilting still remained a popular technique for quilters, especially in instances like the quilt that we're discussing, where you're doing something to mark a special occasion. So to come back to our quilt, Will and Lula had a long and fruitful marriage. They lived in the Red Level of Covington County for the remainder of their lives, and they had 8 children total. As for our quilt, it became known by the Reynolds family as the Bachelor's quilt. The top, pieced in 1900 like we discussed before, the top had already existed, but the backing and the actual quilting, which is the middle part of the quilt, didn't actually occur until 1970, when Will passed the quilt along to his daughter, and she decided that we needed to have a good closure to this story, so she had the members of her church and the community quilt it then. So it's kind of a nice, sweet ending to a little bit of a tragic event. We came into the possession of the quilt in 2017 thanks to Will's granddaughter, Barbara Elwell, who graciously donated it. You can see the quilt here. It's on display in the Voices Gallery. It's actually behind one of the midwife uniforms that I was talking about before. It's hanging up on the wall. So if you have a chance later, please go up and take a closer look at it. Thank you.
I brought some artifacts of my own, and I'll share those with you as we go. My designated artifact here is the Canary cage, used in coal mines in the 19-teens. But in order to get some perspective on this, we actually have to go back about 100 years to the 18-teens, when veterans from the Battle of New Orleans, working their way back up toward Virginia, stopped along Mahan Creek in Bibb County, and some intermarried with some Native Americans. Others brought their families back and began a settlement there, and they began to collect coal. Other folk tales talk about discoveries of coal lying around in various places in the 1820s. By the 1830s and 1840s, residents of Bibb, Blount, Jefferson, Shelby, Tuscaloosa, and Walker counties collected coal in those particular areas. There were some attempts to ship coal along by flatboat down the Black Warrior River as early as the early 1840s, but the shoals along that river prevented long-distance transportation of the coal. They have similar situations with shoals getting in the way in other rivers as well, and so the railroad became very important in transporting coal. The first systematic mining of coal occurred in Alabama in 1849, conducted by William Phineas Brown just west of Montevallo. And by 1860, more than 200 entrepreneurs, independent entrepreneurs, were attempting to mine and market coal in Alabama. These miners used underground mining techniques to extract the coal. Three types of mines existed in Alabama. There were drift mines, where you pretty much followed the seam from an outcropping, slope mines, which were the most prevalent, where you followed an incline down to the coal face, and then there were some shaft mines, where you had an elevator that went straight down to the coal seam. The hand-loading system persisted for about 100 years until it was replaced by mechanization in the 1930s, and later open pit or strip mining replaced underground mining. Miners would follow their slope to the coal face. They used kerosene wicks and lamps early in the 19th century, and the display upstairs actually has a wicked kerosene lamp that they used. Often they would have a small lamp that they would hook to a canvas or linen cap initially, then you turned to hard hats later on as technology developed. The kerosene wick lamps were replaced by carbide lamps in the early 20th century, where you would put carbide in an upper chamber, or rather lower chamber. You'd have water in the upper chamber. You could let the water drip down. It would generate a gas, and then you would light that carbide light, similar to what you did with a Zippo lighter, where you had a flint and could, but again, open flame, which was difficult or dangerous if you had gas in the mine, and many of the mines did so. The carbide lamps were replaced in the 1930s and 1940s by self-contained batteries, so that you had electricity but no open flame there. When the miners got to the coal face, they would use black powder to blast the coal from the seam until this continuous miner mechanization allowed them to use what they call long wall mining, where they would drill in and just churn out the coal from the seam. This was, but it also generated considerable coal dust that could be combustible, similar to what happened to Lusitania in 1915. And black lung, incidentally, also became prevalent, but it was not recognized as a legitimate disease, illness, or condition until the 1950s, after significant testimony before Congress. Initially, mules were used to transport coal cars, which contained 1 to 2 tons of coal. They transported those to the surface. Many of these mules lived underground, and so you would have some mutations as their bodies adapted to dark conditions. And miners also often suffered things for lack of sunlight and had certain conditions that developed from that. Later, the mules would be replaced. When you had electricity, you'd have a big drum at the top and a cable where they could attach the coal cars to that and draw them to the surface. There is a little ditty that the coal miners used to sing to kind of commemorate the use of the mules. It goes this way: my sweetheart's the mule of the mines. I drive her without any lines. On the bumper I sit, and I chew and I spit all over my sweetheart's behind. Somebody was probably bored when they came up with that one. But anyway, what happened in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is that you had single male miners who would go into what amounted to mining camps. If you think about the gold rush in California, 1849, kind of those austere conditions, that's similar to what happened in the mining camps early on. I didn't have a lot of structures. You had some temporary housing, you had saloons, and you had brothels. That's about all those single miners needed. But then by the mid-19-teens, in 1915, you began the Great Migration, where African American workers moved northward to be employed in industry. And then the United States declared war in the spring of 1916, and World War I then caused many of the European immigrants who had been doing a lot of the coal mining to go back to their home countries to fight in World War I. This then created a labor shortage as the single miners were drafted, many of them, which meant that married miners then came to the coal mines to provide the labor that was necessary. But that caused a need for a transition from the mining camps to company towns because those married miners were bringing women and children with them. Consequently, companies built churches, schools, libraries, meeting houses, and provided various types of recreational activities, baseball being the most popular, and many of the company teams played in an industrial league and a few even in the Southern League. There were administrative buildings, a company store, a doctor's office, an engine room, and company housing, which usually were 2, 3, or 4 bedroom houses that were occupied by the miners' families. The companies provided basic services like doctors, social workers, teachers, and others. And the commissary usually was centrally located, and as Jack mentioned earlier, they issued company money, scrip or clacker, or boogaloo as they called it, so coins and paper. There is some clacker up in the display upstairs. I brought some paper scrip here, so you just tear it off in various increments here, and you could spend that at the company store, at the commissary. You got face value if you spend it at the company store. You got discounts if you went off the site and were looking at independent store owners. This situation created a sense of paternalism. Later it was systematized in what we call welfare capitalism. The company provided certain amenities. They also created welfare societies and what they called company unions, which really were organizations to try to get to generate loyalty among their workers so that they would not join labor unions as they tried to organize. The basic mantra was that contented workers don't strike. They did use strike breakers, though, in the event of strikes, or scabs as they were called, and another ready source of strike breakers was the convict lease system, which existed in Alabama from 1872 to 1928, more than half a century. There also were accidents in the mines, and that's what prompts the canary cage here. Rock falls were the predominant means of creating casualties or fatalities. Explosions with the gassy mines also were a close second. Alabama's fatality rate was higher than the national average during the 19-teens, and Alabama had the third highest fatality rate of all mining states, second or third behind Tennessee and Virginia, on into the 1930s and 1940s. There was a Mine Inspection Act of 1890 passed by the Alabama legislature, which required a state mine inspector to visit each mine every 3 months, but there was little benefit or overall effect for the miners. In fact, in 1911, there was a horrendous explosion in the Banner mine just west of Birmingham that killed 125 convicts in one incident. They take the canary cages down because the birds would either get lethargic or perhaps die if there was methane there. So they would watch the birds. If the birds started getting listless, then they knew that there must be gas in the mines, and so they then would evacuate. They also would extinguish all open flames. The canaries were replaced. I brought this one. I have to give my daughters a shout out. They gave this to me for Christmas for a few years ago. But mine, unlike the one upstairs, also has the little porcelain water container here so that the bird could eat on one side, drink on the other. There's still remains of guano there in the bottom too, so realistic artifact there. But then that was replaced by the Davy lamp, which is an interesting piece of engineering because you have an open flame inside the glass here, but then you had the baffling here so that methane, if it was present, would work its way in, but it would be filtered by the baffling so that the amount of methane that got inside would just cause that flame to dim as opposed to create an explosion, so they could watch the color of the flame and the intensity of the flame, and they would know that gas was present. They also watched the rats, because the rats could sense a rock fall or rumblings before the humans did. So, canary cage just reminds us that mining is a hard and dangerous occupation. and many folks died while pursuing this extraction industry. I did find one other song that the miners sang. This was released in 1925, called the Mining Camp Blues, and it says, "Once I had a daddy, and he worked down in a hole, digging and hauling that Birmingham coal. Many times I wondered when they took my daddy down, will he come back to me, will they leave him in the ground? Something like the pitcher that they sent down in the well, wondering will they break it, Lawdy, Lawdy, who can tell? It was late one evening, I was standing at that mine, foreman said my daddy had gone down for his last time. Every day I've waited, sad and worried as can be, waiting for my daddy, thinking he'd come back to me. He was a coal miner from his hat down to his shoes, and I'm nearly dying with these mining camp blues." Thank you.
I invite the speakers to come back up on the stage so we can have some Q&A. I think Dr. English has had to run out, but he will be back. So if you have a question for him, just hold on to it, and I'm sure he'll be back in a moment. Before we begin the Q&A, I did want to make a clarification about the William T. King Plantation slave collar. We did receive a lot of silver and gold items, but it's likely that the slave collar is not one of them. It is very likely brass, but if you go and see it on display, it does look very much like gold, so you can imagine that he was a very wealthy man, and so he wanted people to assume certain things about him.
Questions for Mr. Day. Why did they use canaries? Were they just more susceptible to the gas, or why not another kind of bird?
Yes, I think they were small enough that they could be contained in a small cage. They could put them in a corner or in an obscure place, but still visible. And yes, they are susceptible to the methane, so it was a ready means, a natural means of detecting the gas in the mines.
Mr. McGuire, I was wondering what the industry did to the the pine trees that we had. Was there any effort for reforestation at that time, or was it that not even a concern? You went through, did what you did, and then left it?
Well, can you hear this? At the time, it was a lot of northern capital that came down to the southeast, and the idea was to simply cut out and get out. And that's what a lot of them did at that time. So 19-teens to 1930s, it was just clear-cut the entire thing. And then there was a constant battle with this. Now that the land was opened up, people were burning it on an annual basis, which prevented any trees, for the most part, from regenerating. So that in the 1930s and 1940s, there was a very concerted effort to stem the promiscuous use of fire and also to reforest these areas. And that's what brought about, Auburn University School of Forestry shortly thereafter. So there was a period where there wasn't a whole lot of effort made, but that changed quickly thereafter. So.
We have one right here.
Dr. English, what assurance, if any, or what systems were put in place to ensure that the votes of these freedmen were counted?
Quite a smile, right? Well, there are a few things. One, in a number of elections, particularly in the 1860s, the federal government had actual pollsters, referees, we will call them today, who actually came in to monitor the elections that were held. But in some places, there would actually be, I don't want to call these units malicious, but sort of local committees, political leaders, essentially, who would attempt to make sure individuals would not intimidate persons who were coming to the polls or in some instances even escorted individuals who had to move, say, from their home place, moving to a county seat again, which could be dangerous, not only because of individuals whose intentions were not necessarily great, but also because of weather and a number of bad road conditions and so forth. But ultimately, the primary check for wrongdoing essentially lay in the hands of not only the local election officials, but also the electors themselves. It would not be, quite frankly, until about the 1950s that individuals would have real assurances for persons who did not want African Americans in particular to vote. And of course, that would come about by actual referees coming in. That's 1950s and the 1960s, and then of course by federal legislation such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But of course, even those sorts of things could not prevent individuals who really wanted certain persons not to vote, because we still see certain activities going on right now that are prohibiting individuals from voting, although they both ethically and, quite frankly, legally should be doing so.
Yeah, I have a question for Jack. Jack, there were black and white coal miners, and I think they worked at least somewhat effectively in unions to try to improve their conditions. What about the ore miners? Were there many white ore miners, and were they able to work with black ore miners together to put some pressure on the companies?
I think it was a little bit different situation in the red ore mines. I think that in the early days, the underground workforce was almost exclusively African American. And Horace Huntley has written a book on American Apartheid, I believe is the title. And what he found is that once the mines began to mechanize so that a person could work underground without doing the work of in the old days where a man would have to pick up a 50-pound block of iron and throw it into a car, he could work some kind of machinery and still make the good money. That the whites began to take over the underground work. There was still a mix of blacks and whites underground, but from there on, the jobs tended to go, the technological, the advanced jobs tend to go to the white man, and the black man continued as a laborer. And I might add, during this period of time that African Americans were the exclusive workers, they had a very efficient system for operating underground. They had a drill operator who ran the drill, and he had a helper. And then he had, on that same team, maybe 3 to 5 muckers, they were called. And these were the guys that did the actual lifting, 10-hour days, just lifting these immensely heavy loads. And I would assume that a lot of white men thought, well, that's not white man's work. And black men took it because of the opportunities they could find that way.
I have a question about the turpentine and also the relationship with the logging industry. I know you said that once these trees had kind of been played out that they were cut and harvested, but and this was also the time that logging really kind of grew up in Alabama. Was there anything that would determine which trees you would do the turpentine and which you would just cut for the lumber, and just sort of the relationship with that? And also a little bit about, talk a few minutes about the turpentine camps, about the workers and how they lived.
Sure. Well, the first question is, size of the tree obviously determined whether or not it was appropriate to put a face on. But as you maybe recall from that picture of Call Lumber Company, once they found a tree, they were very aggressive in the number of faces that they put on it. I think that tree had 4 faces on it in the picture. And there were attempts to bring some sustainability to the industry with conservative turpentine operations, but I haven't really seen any sort of information that shows that was largely successful. So they were, as they would try to extract as much of the resource as they could. So small trees, probably 5-inch diameter, 6-inch diameter, trees larger. And then at that point, they would just cut them, and you can see pictures in some of these logging sawmill areas where the trees laying in the ponds, the mill ponds, actually had the faces still on them. So as, you know, and they would figure out ways to, depending on what the resource was that they were trying to make. If it was saw timber, you know, they would just cut that piece off, you know, slab off and not use it. But you can actually see, and I've seen this, like telephone poles that have the old faces still on them, which is kind of interesting to see. So I don't know if that answers it. You know, they weren't very discriminating. If they could make money off of it, you know, it was done. I mean, there was a lot of investment brought down to this part of the world at that time. The conditions of the camps themselves, I mean, again, it's like the same story here. I mean, labor was cheap, and they tried to take advantage of it as best they could. It wasn't in some of these larger camps where you had the commissary and the quarters and that sorts of things. It was a paternalistic type system that they were trying to embody, to have, and the conditions weren't dissimilar from what was described here earlier. So.
Next question.
Well, it ain't so much as a question, but one thing about the 1967 voting documents that you can find online and stuff, or let's say not the documents, but the list of people who were registered to vote, I could find out you can use that sometimes to find out where your people, especially if they're black, came out of slavery at, what county they were in. Usually just it was 67, so that's 4 years after slavery. They hadn't moved far, so that you could find out where they were at that time as to where they would be later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
In all of your presentations, it came across how extremely hardworking Alabamians were. Could you comment on that, and also about the northern investment? If any Alabamians owned any of the processes that they were working with?
I don't think you have to go back too many generations to find out that our ancestors worked really hard just to make a living and just to survive, which makes me grateful that I don't have to work that hard. As a rule, in coal mining, what happened, and in a lot of southern industry, and there's a debate among historians as to whether there was southern industry prior to the Civil War or whether it came after the Civil War. And if before the Civil War, which I think there's plenty of evidence that there is, then what was the extent of that southern industry? And what you had were people like Daniel Pratt, some others who had come from the North, but really became southern entrepreneurs. They had the capital, they had the resources, they had the technology, the know-how, and so they generated their particular industry. As with Daniel Pratt, he converted his money into Confederate war bonds. So when the Confederacy lost, obviously he lost his fortune, but he still knew how to make cotton gins. He still was a businessman and knew how to make a living, and that's what you get as you move into the Gilded Age, is you get the boom and bust kind of thing. Henry de Bardeleben was his son-in-law, inherited his wealth, and they did a coking test at Oxmoor Furnace in Birmingham in 1876, converting coal to coke so that they then could produce pig iron that fed the steel and iron industry of Birmingham. So they still had the know-how. They still had, in many cases, the infrastructure for doing that. What they didn't have was money or capital. And so after the Civil War, what they had to do is they had to look to northern boards of directors or investors who would invest the capital. And so in many cases, you still had southern industrialists, southern entrepreneurs, southern industry, but it was financed through northern money. And then TCI is another great example of what happens there with northern control of southern industry because they don't have that investment of the southern culture. they're looking to make a profit, and so in many cases that would adversely affect the southern industry. Does that address your question?